Imagine stepping onto a luxurious first-class flight, expecting a seamless experience, only to be told, without explanation, that you don't belong there. That's exactly what happened to one elderly woman who had no idea her fate was about to take a dramatic turn. She wasn't just any passenger, she was the mother of a global icon, a man whose name alone commands respect. But to the airline staff that day, she was just another traveler, one they believed wasn't fit for first class. What they didn't realize, though, was that they weren't just rejecting an ordinary customer. They were turning away the woman who raised the very person who owned the airline. This is the story of how Big Shaq's mother, a humble yet strong-willed woman, found herself in an unexpected confrontation at 30,000 feet. She had lived a life of quiet dignity, never flaunting her son's wealth or success. To her, respect was something earned, not bought. But when she stepped onto that plane, dressed modestly and carrying herself with quiet confidence, she was met with dismissive glances and judgmental whispers. The flight attendant barely looked at her ticket before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said with forced politeness. "There must be a mistake. This section is reserved for first-class passengers only." Shaq's mother stood there, confused. She had booked her seat well in advance. She had every right to be there. And yet, she found herself being told to move, to give up her place, without so much as an explanation. The tension in the air was thick. Other passengers in the first-class cabin stole glances, some pretending not to notice, others watching with curiosity. The airline staff, unaware of who she was, continued to insist that she step aside. But what happens when the truth comes out? What happens when the very person they dismissed with such arrogance turns out to be more powerful than they could have ever imagined? One phone call. That's all it would take. And the moment that call was made, everything would change in an instant. As the flight crew continued their quiet but firm resistance, Big Shaq's mother clutched her boarding pass, her fingers tightening around the thin paper. She had been raised to handle life's troubles with grace, but something about the way they looked at her, doubtful, dismissive, as if she were an inconvenience rather than a paying passenger, made her chest tighten with quiet indignation. She wasn't a woman who demanded special treatment. If anything, she had spent her entire life avoiding the spotlight, even as her son's name echoed across the world. But today, standing in the middle of this luxury cabin, she felt something was off. It wasn't just about her seat, it was something deeper, something unspoken. It was in the way the flight attendant's eyes darted toward the cockpit, in the hushed voices between the crew, in the way other passengers, comfortable in their designer suits and expensive jewelry, pretended not to notice the growing scene in front of them. Just days ago, Shaq had begged her to let him send a private jet, but she had refused. She didn't want the extravagance, the unnecessary attention. She was a woman of tradition, of humility, and she had always believed in keeping things simple. After all, wealth meant nothing if you forgot where you came from. So, she had booked this flight the old-fashioned way, using her own account, wanting to travel without fuss. But now, as the flight attendant glanced at a clipboard one more time and shook her head, the sense of unease grew stronger. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your seat has been reassigned," she repeated, her tone sharper this time. The words hung in the air, thick with finality. But why? What reason could they possibly have for moving her? The ticket had been confirmed. The payment had gone through. There was no mistake. Unless, of course, someone wanted there to be a mistake. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, her mind racing back to the past few weeks. Shaq had been unusually busy lately, more than usual. There had been whispered conversations behind closed doors, secretive meetings, a tension in his voice whenever she called. Something was happening in his world, something he hadn't told her about. And now, here she was, caught in the middle of a situation that didn't feel random at all. Could this be connected? Was this just a simple case of miscommunication, or was there something more at play? The airline staff's insistence, the strange energy in the cabin, the way her name had suddenly disappeared from the first-class list. It was all too deliberate. Passengers began shifting in their seats, sensing the standoff unfolding before them. Some were irritated at the delay, while others, those more perceptive, seemed to recognize that this was no ordinary seating mishap. Then, as if to confirm her suspicions, she caught a glimpse of a man seated toward the back of first class, someone she hadn't noticed before. He wore dark sunglasses, a crisp suit, and had an air of detachment, yet his posture was too rigid, his focus too sharp. He wasn't watching her, not directly, but he was listening, waiting. And at that moment, she knew this wasn't just about her seat. Something much bigger was happening, and she had just become an unexpected part of it. A cold prickle ran down Shaq's mother's spine as she turned away from the man in the sunglasses, pretending she hadn't noticed him. Something about the way he sat, unnaturally still, sent a warning through her instincts, an instinct honed from years of raising a son in the harsh spotlight of fame. She knew when something wasn't right, and this was one of those moments. But before she could process her next move, the flight attendant's voice cut through her thoughts, now more forceful. "Ma'am, you'll have to step aside. We need to sort this out." The choice of words struck her. Sort this out. Not a simple mistake. Not a system error. Something needed to be sorted. She glanced at her boarding pass again, as if expecting the ink to suddenly change, to reflect whatever lie was being forced upon her. But it was still there, bold, undeniable proof that she belonged in this seat. And yet, somehow, she didn't. Somehow, between the moment she boarded and now, her place had been erased. The growing unease in her chest turned into something heavier, something close to fear. Not for herself, but for what this meant, for what or who was behind it. Just then, a different voice, low and urgent, reached her ears. "Don't push this." She turned sharply, but whoever had spoken had already vanished into the rows of seats behind her. It was barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to make her pulse quicken. Someone wanted her to stop asking questions. But why? Why her? Why now? Before she could react, the flight attendant snatched the boarding pass from her hand, scanning it with exaggerated care. Then, without looking up, she shook her head. "Strange," she murmured. "The system shows no record of this seat being booked under your name." The words sent a jolt through her. That was impossible. She had the confirmation email, the ticket stub, even the charge on her bank statement. But before she could pull out her phone, she realized her purse was gone. Her heartbeat slammed in her chest. She had it when she stepped onto the plane, tucked safely under her arm. Now, it had vanished. And with it, any proof that she was telling the truth. A hollow feeling spread in her stomach as she scanned the cabin again. The man in the sunglasses had turned slightly, his gaze still unreadable behind those dark lenses. Was it him? The flight attendant? Or was it someone she hadn't even noticed yet? Her hands clenched at her sides. Someone had planned this. Someone wanted her isolated, disoriented, unsure of herself. And the worst part, it was working. Her mind raced back to Shaq's unusual behavior in recent weeks, the late-night calls, the closed-door meetings, the tension in his voice whenever she asked about his business. Could this be connected? Was this about him? Or was this something else entirely, something buried in the past, waiting for the perfect moment to resurface? Then, just as she opened her mouth to demand answers, the plane's intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice, deep and steady, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing an unexpected delay. We ask for your patience as we resolve a small issue before takeoff." But she wasn't fooled. This wasn't just a small issue. This was something bigger, something dangerous. And whatever was happening, whatever they were trying to hide, it had only just begun. As the captain's voice faded from the intercom, a strange silence settled over the cabin. Shaq's mother remained frozen in place, her mind a battlefield of unanswered questions. She could feel the flight crew watching her, their expressions unreadable, their stance just a little too rigid. She could still hear the whisper from moments ago, "Don't push this." The warning clung to her skin like a cold sweat. But then, as if the universe wasn't done playing tricks on her, a sudden vibration in the cabin pulled her attention. Someone's phone was ringing. A few rows back, a businessman in a tailored suit fumbled to silence his device, but that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the ringtone. The chime was eerily familiar, Shaq's personal alert tone, the one he had set for his most private contacts. It was a custom sound he had picked years ago, one that played only when something serious was happening. She turned sharply, her pulse hammering, watching as the man hesitated before answering. His voice was hushed, but she caught just enough to know he wasn't speaking casually. What if this wasn't just about her being denied a first-class seat? What if this wasn't even about her at all? And then, just when she thought she had pieced together the worst of it, the plane's intercom crackled again. But this time, it wasn't the captain's voice. It was someone else. Someone whose voice was cold, deliberate, unfamiliar. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice said, smooth as glass. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, we'll be experiencing a slight change in our flight plan." Shaq's mother gripped the armrests, her fingers digging into the leather. A change in the flight plan? No, this wasn't a delay. This wasn't a mistake. This was a hijacking. The moment the unfamiliar voice crackled through the intercom, the entire cabin seemed to shrink, suffocating under the weight of an unseen threat. Shaq's mother sat frozen, her breath shallow, her pulse a chaotic rhythm against her ribs. A change in the flight plan, those words replayed in her mind, each syllable laced with quiet menace. The passengers around her stiffened, their heads turning toward one another in confusion, waiting for an explanation that didn't come. The flight attendants, usually composed, looked shaken, their expressions slipping just enough to reveal that whatever was happening, they hadn't been expecting it either. And then, as the intercom cut to static, the plane jolted just slightly, just enough for her to feel it in her bones. Not turbulence. Not a routine course correction. This was intentional. They were being taken somewhere else. Somewhere they weren't supposed to go. The realization settled in her stomach like a stone, heavy and cold. Her fingers itched toward her phone, but she forced herself to stop. Someone had already taken her purse, and whoever sent that warning text was watching. If they knew she had a backup, she might lose that too. Right now, her only advantage was that no one expected her to be prepared. But before she could plan her next move, something else caught her attention, something that sent a fresh wave of unease washing over her. The man in the expensive suit, the one who had left his seat after receiving that mysterious message, was now returning from the back of the plane. But he wasn't alone. A second man followed closely behind him, walking with calculated ease, his presence too commanding to ignore. His sharp gaze swept over the cabin, as if taking stock of the situation, but it wasn't until he turned slightly, just enough for the dim overhead light to catch his face, that Shaq's mother felt her entire world tilt. She knew that face. Not from TV, not from any of Shaq's business dealings, but from her own past. A past she had buried. A past she had sworn she'd never have to confront again. The man's hair had grayed, his frame a little leaner than before, but his presence was unmistakable. Joseph King, a name she hadn't spoken in over 3 decades. The memories crashed into her all at once, nights spent looking over her shoulder, whispered conversations in darkened rooms, the quiet fear that she had spent years outrunning. Back then, Joseph King had been untouchable, a shadow lurking behind powerful figures, a ghost in the business world who never left fingerprints. He had always operated from a distance, making moves that changed lives without ever being seen. And now, after all these years, after believing she had left that chapter behind, here he was. On this plane. The realization was a thunderclap in her mind. This wasn't about Shaq. This wasn't about a first-class seat. This was about her. She gripped the armrests tighter, forcing herself to stay calm, as Joseph made his way toward her row. He didn't rush. He wanted her to see him coming. He wanted her to feel the weight of his presence before he even spoke. And when he finally stopped just inches from her seat, he smiled calm, unbothered, as if they were old friends meeting by chance. "I was hoping we'd run into each other," he murmured, his voice smooth, familiar, laced with a dangerous kind of nostalgia. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" Her throat tightened. Her mind screamed at her to react, to fight, to run, but where? They were thousands of feet in the air, trapped in a plane that was no longer heading where it was supposed to. And for the first time in years, she realized she wasn't just a passenger on a diverted flight. She was a target. Shaq's mother felt her pulse hammering in her ears, drowning out the murmurs of confused passengers and the muffled roar of the engines. Joseph King stood before her, his presence a cruel reminder that the past was never really behind her. The smirk on his face was casual, almost amused, but there was an unmistakable weight in his gaze. He wasn't here to reminisce. He was here for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it wasn't good. "Yeah, I'm here," he muttered. A pause. Then his eyes flickered in her direction, sharp and assessing. "Understood. I'll handle it." Her stomach lurched. Handle what? Who was this man talking to? And why did he have her son's emergency alert tone? The thought that Shaq could somehow be involved in all of this, knowingly or not, made her blood run cold. But before she could process it, the situation took another turn. Somewhere outside the plane, beyond the reinforced windows, flashing blue and red lights sliced through the dimming evening. Police, TSA agents, a small cluster of airport security was rushing toward the jetway, their radios crackling with urgent chatter. Several passengers noticed, their murmurs rippling through first class. Was it a routine check? An unrelated disturbance? Or was this about her? And then, as if things couldn't spiral further, her phone, her backup phone, hidden in the inner pocket of her coat, buzzed with a message. A single notification, nothing more. The sender's name was blocked, the text brief, but enough to send an icy shiver down her spine. "They're not after you. They're after him. Stop asking questions before it's too late." For a moment, everything around her blurred. The missing purse, the erased ticket, the man with Shaq's emergency ringtone, the mysterious warning, the sudden police presence. None of this was coincidence. Someone was pulling the strings, making calculated moves, and she had walked straight into the middle of it. But who was him? Shaq? The man on the phone? Someone else entirely? Her fingers clenched around her coat as her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She had always believed in trusting her instincts, and right now, they were screaming at her that this was only the beginning. Whatever game was being played, whatever truth was being buried, she wasn't sure she wanted to know anymore. But she also knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, charged with an invisible tension that wrapped around Shaq's mother like a tightening noose. The flashing lights outside the window reflected off the polished surfaces of first class, casting eerie patterns on the walls, illuminating faces that suddenly seemed more suspicious than before. Every whispered conversation, every stolen glance, felt calculated. Someone on this plane knew exactly what was happening, but she didn't. And that terrified her. She clutched the fabric of her coat, where her backup phone was hidden, her mind racing through the cryptic message she had just received. "They're not after you. They're after him." The words rattled inside her skull, sharp and insistent. But who was him? Shaq? That man on the phone? Someone else entirely? Her gut told her she was missing a critical piece of the puzzle. But there was no time to figure it out now. The situation was unraveling too fast. Then, without warning, the cabin lights flickered. A collective hush fell over the passengers as the overhead panels dimmed, casting everything in a dull, unnatural glow. It lasted only a few seconds, but that was all it took. When the lights came back, something was different. The man with the sunglasses, the one who had been watching her, was gone. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She twisted in her seat, scanning the cabin, her breath coming faster now. He had been sitting just a few rows behind her, unmoving, as if waiting for something. And now? Vanished. No footsteps. No movement. Just gone. She turned back to the flight attendant, who was still gripping her confiscated boarding pass. But something in the woman's expression had changed. If before there had been firm politeness, now there was something closer to unease. Almost as if she was no longer in control of the situation either. "Please, ma'am, return to your seat," she said, softer this time. Less of a demand, more of a plea. But before Shaq's mother could respond, another phone buzzed from somewhere deeper in first class. A different man, tall, broad-shouldered, with an expensive watch and a too-perfect suit, pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the screen. His entire body went rigid. His eyes flicked toward her, then away just as fast. He didn't speak, didn't move, but something in his face shifted, like a decision had just been made. And then, just as quickly as the last man disappeared, he stood up and slipped toward the back of the plane. A cold, electric terror rushed through her veins. She was being watched, but not just by one person, by several. And whatever this was, it wasn't random. She could feel it now, the weight of some larger scheme pressing down on her, moving around her like invisible hands closing in. She forced herself to stay still, to breathe, to think. The warning text, the missing purse, the erased ticket, the man with Shaq's ringtone, the vanishing passenger, the police outside. And now, this other man, leaving without a word, as if he had just received new instructions. She forced herself to breathe, to keep her expression neutral, even as panic clawed at the edges of her mind. The last time she had seen Joseph King, she had been much younger, caught up in a world she had no business being in. A world of whispered deals and dangerous men who made people disappear when they became inconvenient. She had walked away from that life. She had built something better, something safe. But now, as Joseph's shadow loomed over her, she knew that whatever she thought she had escaped had finally caught up to her. "I don't know what you think this is," she said, keeping her voice even, measured, "but I have nothing to do with you anymore." Joseph chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Oh, I think you do." He slid into the empty seat across from her, leaning in just enough for his voice to be heard over the hum of the plane. "You see, I didn't just happen to be on this flight, and I certainly didn't arrange for you to be here by accident. This has been in motion for a long time." His eyes flickered toward her coat, the subtle bulge of her hidden phone, not escaping his notice. "Go ahead. Text someone. Call for help. See if it makes a difference." Her fingers twitched, but she didn't move. She knew better. Joseph King wasn't the type to bluff. If he was this confident, it meant he had already accounted for every move she could make. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. Who else was involved? Had Shaq unknowingly been dragged into this? Was this why someone had warned her to stop asking questions? Was he the one they were after? The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her, but she pushed it down. She couldn't afford to panic now. Then Joseph's smirk faded, and his eyes darkened. "You have something I need." His voice dropped to something almost deadly in its calmness. "And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." Her breath caught in her throat. No, that wasn't possible. The only thing he could be referring to was something she had buried literally 3 decades ago. She had made sure it was gone, erased from existence. But now, looking into Joseph King's cold, knowing eyes, she realized her mistake. She had underestimated the kind of men she was dealing with back then. She had underestimated him. Her mind reeled. If he was looking for it now, it meant something had changed. Someone had dug too deep. Someone had brought it back into play. But who? And why now? "I don't have it," she said, forcing the words out. Joseph tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether to believe her. Then he let out a slow sigh, leaning back in his seat. "That's unfortunate," he murmured. "Because you see, I'm a man who likes options, and I don't have many left." He nodded subtly toward the front of the plane, where 2 more men had appeared, one near the cockpit door, the other taking a slow, deliberate seat near the aisle. The message was clear. She wasn't getting off this plane unless Joseph King allowed it. Then, with an almost sympathetic smile, he delivered the ultimatum. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me where it is. Or this plane," he gestured around casually, "never makes it to its destination." A sick, twisting sensation coiled in her stomach. He wasn't bluffing. He had hijacked this flight, orchestrated every detail, and now the lives of every passenger on board were in her hands. She could give him what he wanted, but she didn't have it. And even if she did, she knew men like him. If she gave him what he wanted, she wasn't walking away from this. But if she refused, what then? Her throat went dry as she realized the impossible truth. No matter what she chose, the outcome wouldn't just affect her. It would affect everyone. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt the icy weight of something worse than fear. Powerlessness. The air inside the abandoned warehouse was thick with dust and the scent of rusted metal. Shaq's mother moved cautiously, her pulse hammering against her ribs as she gripped the small recording device hidden inside her pocket. This was it, the moment everything had been leading up to. The cryptic warnings, the erased footage, the missing evidence, it all pointed here, to this place, to this final confrontation. She wasn't alone. Across the dimly lit space, Joseph King stood waiting, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, watching her every move. "You're persistent," he mused, the corners of his lips curling into a smirk. "I'll give you that." She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was racing, piecing together everything she had uncovered in the past few days. The fake apartment, the deleted files, the carefully staged narrative about a lone shooter. It had all been a distraction, a carefully constructed lie meant to hide the real truth. "You framed him," she said finally, her voice steady despite the weight of her realization. "The shooter wasn't the mastermind. You were." Joseph let out a small chuckle, clapping slowly. "Congratulations. You figured it out. But now what?" He gestured around the empty space. "No one's coming to save you. No news crew. No FBI raid. Just you and me." Her fingers tightened around the recorder. She had been careful, so careful. Before coming here, she had uploaded the audio logs, the security footage fragments she managed to recover, and the final piece of evidence, a wire transfer linking Joseph King to an offshore account used to fund the operation. Everything was in place. All she needed was one last confession. She took a step closer, her voice low but firm. "It wasn't just the mall, was it? The second apartment, the other targets, you had a plan. The shooter was just a pawn, someone you could manipulate, make disposable. You needed an event big enough to cause panic, big enough to push your real agenda forward." His smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. Annoyance. A sliver of frustration that she had come this far. "You talk too much," he said, slipping his hand inside his jacket. For a split second, her instincts screamed at her to run. She knew what was coming, knew what men like him did when they were cornered. But before she could react, a sound filled the warehouse, a sharp, high-pitched chime from his phone. Joseph hesitated, glancing down. His expression darkened. Then, without another word, he turned and bolted toward the exit. Confusion twisted in her gut, but she couldn't let him get away. She sprinted after him, her breath burning in her throat. Just as he reached the door, a blinding flood of headlights washed over them. Tires screeched. A fleet of black SUVs skidded into place, cutting off any escape route. Doors flew open, and armed agents swarmed the scene, shouting commands. Joseph froze, his hands lifting slowly in surrender. His smirk was gone now, replaced with something colder, something calculating. He turned his gaze back to her, his voice eerily calm. "You think this ends with me?" A chill crept down her spine. Sirens wailed in the distance. She clutched the recorder in her pocket, her heart still hammering. They had enough to bring down Joseph King's operation, enough to expose the truth. But as the smoke billowed into the night sky, one thought haunted her. He was right. This wasn't over. Not even close. Over the next few days, the truth slowly unraveled, bleeding into the media in carefully measured doses. The public only knew what they were meant to know, that a dangerous individual had been exposed, that a potential disaster had been prevented, and that justice was in motion. But behind the scenes, those who had worked the case knew better. The evidence they had gathered was enough to dismantle Joseph King's known network, but it wasn't enough to find him. He had vanished without a trace, leaving no paper trail, no digital footprint, nothing. The offshore accounts had been drained, the safe houses abandoned, and every known associate had gone silent. It was as if he had never existed at all. Still, there was victory in what they had accomplished. The victims of the attack would not be forgotten. The lives lost would not be in vain. And most importantly, the lie, the one meant to manipulate an entire nation, had been exposed. The shooter had been a weapon, but now the world knew whose hand had pulled the trigger. That truth alone had power. It would haunt those who had tried to bury it. Shaq's mother sat alone that night, staring at the recorder on her desk, her fingers hovering over the play button. She had already listened to it 100 times, memorized every pause, every intake of breath before Joseph King had spoken. "You think this ends with me?" His words echoed in her mind like a prophecy. He had been so certain, so smug, and the worst part was, he wasn't wrong. Even though he was gone, his influence still lingered, like a shadow stretching into the unknown. And yet, despite the danger, despite the threats that would surely come, she felt something else stir within her, something stronger than fear. She had spent her life believing that power belonged to those who held the wealth, those who controlled the narrative, those who operated in the dark. But she had proven that wasn't true. She had shattered their illusion, forced the truth into the light, and though the war wasn't over, she had won this battle. That meant something. That was something.